Good day, grade 12 learners. Welcome to today's Life Sciences lesson. My name is Sina Sekheche, and this lesson, like usual, is brought to you by the Free State Department of Education in collaboration with Pagama Research and Development. Right, so to continue with today's topic, as you see on our introductory slide there, we are still busy with the topic of evolution. However, today we will be doing part 2 of the topic. And remember, I said this topic, we're going to divide it into 3 parts. So the part that we did last week was introduction to evolution. And now we will be checking the theories that are underpinning the theory of evolution. And then next, we're going to do the human evolution. So that will be our third part. Right. So for today's lesson, let us check what is it that we need to achieve or that we need to be able to know at the end of the session. Right. At the end of this lesson, you should be able to discuss the ideas on evolution in order of their origin as follows. So you need to understand what is Lamarckism, Darwinism, and punctuated equilibrium. How are these theories explaining evolution? Then you also be able to discuss the reasons why Lamarck's theory is being rejected. So this is an exam question. You need to know why. Then you also need to know Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. Right. It's because Darwin explains the theory of evolution by natural selection. So you should be able to discuss how does he explain that evolution took place by natural selection. Then you should also be able to explain to us what punctuated equilibrium is, and it says that it explains the speed at which evolution takes place. So this one is the most recent, so we will delve into that, but at the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain how punctuated equilibrium came about and how does it explain the theory of evolution. Then you also need to know or be able to discuss what is artificial selection. Going on, you should know the biological concepts such as species. Then you are going to explain them as organisms that are similar and that are capable of interbreeding and producing a fertile offspring. So that is just terminology that you need to be familiar with, together with population also, because when we are doing speciation, these terms are very important. Then you need to be able to discuss speciation and extinction and the effect of each on biodiversity. So you will tell you what is speciation and how does it occur, and extinction, you know this from grade 10, but you must also be able to tell us what are the effects of both on biodiversity. Right, then you need to be able to describe the whole process of speciation through geographic isolation. Then you must know or have a brief outline of the reproductive isolation mechanisms. Now, when organisms are isolated, what could be the reason that they are not able to reproduce again? So these are the isolation mechanisms that you need to know. And then any one example of natural selection and evolution in present times. So we will discuss that as we talk about evolution in present time, the DDT, and also COVID-19 can also be an example of that. So one of the examples of natural selections will be discussed later as they were studied. Right. To get onto the first objective, remember we said you need to know the theories of evolution as they appear or in the order in which they appear. So the first person that we are going to look at today who attempted to explain how things, organisms evolved, the person that we are going to study first is Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, so known as Lamarck, or as you say, aka also known as Lamarck. So Lamarck is the easiest way to remember this scientist. So Lamarck came with this theory in the early 1800s. So early 1800s, when you think of these years, you were not even here. Even our parents were not here. This was in the 18th century. So it was far, 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 far long, but already there were some scientists that were already working on trying to explain the theory of evolution. So let us look at what Lamarck says. So you must know this name, familiarize yourself with this name, because you have to distinguish between Lamarck and Darwin. So you need to know which one is this one. So this scientist, he explained evolution using the following two ways. The first one is this one. I'm going to circle around number 1. It is the law of use and disuse. In the examination, when you are asked to say, what are the laws that Lamarck used to explain his theory of evolution, you are going to say the first one. He used the law of use and disuse to explain the theory of evolution. And then the second one, he said the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So that is another law or another principle that he used to explain his theory of evolution. So what do these two principles say? Let us look at the first one. The first one is so easy to remember because it says the law of use and disuse, meaning in the explanation you must check for use and disuse, meaning not using. Right. So he went on to say, as an organism uses a structure, so here's the use. As an organism uses a structure or organ more regularly, it becomes better developed. So use will lead to that organ or that structure to becoming better developed. So that is the first thing that he said. So you have already unpacked the use. So he is explaining to say, when an organism uses a structure or an organ more regularly, it becomes better developed or enlarged. Right. Then if an organism does not, so now you are delving into the second part of disuse. So here, does not use a structure or organ frequently, it becomes less developed. You know, for writing these two, you can get 3 marks or 4 marks depending on how the question was structured. So the first one, when you say explain how Lamarck have used the theories, the principles to explain the theory of evolution, you are going to say he used the first principle of law of use and disuse. And in the law of use and disuse, what did it say? It says that if an organism uses a structure or an organ more regularly, it becomes better developed. So you say you use more, becomes better developed. And then if you do not use, it becomes less developed or reduced in size and may disappear altogether. So for writing all of these, you can get yourself 2 marks or 4 marks depending on how the question was phrased. But please know the law of use and disuse. And already in your mind, try to internalize it to say, okay, try to think of examples where an organism can use something, and that thing, if it is used more, it is going to become better and become more developed. And then again, if that organism does not use that particular structure or organ, it will become less developed or reduced in size, or it may eventually disappear. I know there are a lot of crazy ideas that you can think of to apply this law of use and disuse. But he did not stop there. He said, for these organisms to evolve again, the inheritance of acquired characteristics says that characteristics developed during the life of an individual, meaning they were acquired. These are not born with. Let me write here. Not born with. You acquire them, meaning you get them as you go in life. It can be passed on to their offspring. Here, I like to make an example for you to understand. To say, if a father of a child, let's say a father, exercises and lifts up weights, and they build strong muscles. According to Lamarck, the law of inheritance of acquired characteristics, it says that the child that is going to be born of that father is going to be born with those muscles. Now, does that make sense to you? According to the way you know that we inherit the characteristics that we have today, having studied genetics, having studied meiosis, now can you agree with that? You don't have to agree with it right now because we will explore the reasons why it was rejected. But I'm telling you now, this theory of Lamarck was rejected because, number one, Lamarck says if an organism use a structure, that structure is going to be what? To be better developed. But if an organism does not use the structure becomes less developed. So you please collect marks. And then that characteristic that was developed during a life of an individual, meaning that one that was developed here, here. What is going to happen to it? He says it is going to be passed on to their offspring. Just like that. So he used an examples of giraffes. So if you take a look at this giraffes, according to Lamarck, the giraffes had short necks, and giraffes kept on using their necks to stretch and reach for food on tall trees. Right. So when they kept on using their necks or stretching their necks, we ended up with giraffes with long necks. And then he will further say this long neck is going to be passed on. So this is just an example or a brief explanation trying to understand this, what Lamarck was saying here. So with the example of giraffes, he would say that giraffes initially had short necks. They kept stretching their necks trying to reach for food on tall trees, and then eventually the giraffes acquired the characteristic of long necks, and that characteristic of long necks was passed on to the offspring. So you've applied both the law of use and disuse, and also the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So please be on the lookout for this. Before you answer any question, make sure that your answer has use in it, and it also has disuse if the example allows you. And also make sure that you tell us what is going to happen to that acquired characteristic. And you must say acquired characteristic, because you don't talk about genes here. You talk about acquired characteristic, whatever that you see on the outside. So he says whatever that you see on the outside that was acquired based on the behavior is going to be passed on to the offspring. We will leave it at that. We are just studying. This is how he explained that organisms evolved. Then, this is just a further explanation looking on his theory of evolution using the giraffes. So Lamarck's approach using the giraffe as an example, he would say, every time when you talk about Lamarck is talking about all. You're saying initially everything was the same. So all giraffes had short necks originally. So I will teach you how to compare the Lamarckism and Darwinism, because the way we start explaining Lamarck's theory, we must talk about all being the same originally. But with Darwin, we will see that he speaks about variation when he starts. But let us not go into that. We will see when we talk about Darwin. Then we will go back to Lamarck and just try to compare the two scientists as how they were explaining their theory of evolution. So Lamarck, about the giraffes, he will say all giraffes had short necks. Here's the first giraffe. It had short neck, so it is short-necked. So you see, it's the ancestor, or you can say the ancestor of giraffes all had short necks. But what is important is to say that all of them were the same. Then, giraffes frequently stretched or used their necks to reach for leaves on tall trees. So here, you see the arrow going up now, taking you to the second giraffe, showing what it is using. So here is the use. The giraffes kept on stretching and using their necks to reach for food on higher up trees. Then for 3, it shows you that it kept on stretching and stretching. Then it caused the necks to become longer. Now, the necks are now longer on number 4. They are longer. You see? So, the characteristics of long necks. Now, this is the acquired characteristics. Acquired, see, in this way was then passed on to the next generation. Here you do not say allele, you say characteristic, because you are talking about something that is on the external, that is on the outside, that you can see. So this characteristic, it is passed on to offspring. So I think now you see. Now, eventually, forming offspring with longer neck than the generation before. So as these from 4 to 5 to 6 to 7, all will have what now? Long necks as they reproduce. So all of this is according to Lamarck. I want you to take a moment and think about another example that can make sense to you. Do you think this is true? Do you think this makes sense? That if you use something and then you stop using it, it will not develop and it will disappear. But if you use it, it will develop and become more efficient, and then you can pass that thing to the offspring. Now you are thinking as a scientist, using the background that you know about genetics and meiosis, that there is somewhere that it cannot be true. But let us try to apply Lamarck's theory on other examples. In your mind, with those examples that you have, try to apply all of this and check if it applies or it works with those scenarios that you have. But we can use this example here to check or to apply Lamarck's theory, or to try to explain how he would have explained the evolution of the organisms that we find here. So let us take a look at this extract here. I'm going to read the extract for you, and then we will try to see what the questions are. The extract reads, "The red-bellied black snake," meaning these are the black snakes that have red bellies. Black snake with red bellies underneath. This is the scientific name for that particular snake. You don't need to know the scientific name. Now, just check. The red-bellied black snakes and the green tree snake. Now, this is the green tree snake. So, this one, it lives on trees. These ones, this is also the scientific name for that particular snake. So, we have 2 snakes here. The red-bellied black snake and the green tree snake are predators that sometimes feed on cane toads. So what do they eat? They eat cane toads. This is a scientific name for cane toads that contain a toxin that may kill them. So meaning the cane toads have a poison that may kill them. We can say a toxin is a poison. Now, the snakes consume the toads by swallowing them whole. How do these snakes eat these toads? They swallow them whole. A decrease in the average jaw size of the snake has been observed over a period of 70 years. Meaning, the jaw size. Remember, in order for you to swallow something that is big, your jaw should be big as well. However, it was noticed that over a period of 70 years, the average jaw size of the snakes decreased. It decreased. So it became smaller and smaller as the snakes kept on evolving. With this change, it was also noted that the snakes could no longer swallow large cane toads because now their jaws have become smaller. This has resulted in an increase in the survival of the snakes. So now you add more snakes. Name Lamarck's laws. So this is just a straightforward question to say Lamarck uses which two laws or which two principles to explain his theory of evolution. So here you are going to say what? The law of, and number two, the law of, we've discussed them. Then question number two says, how would Lamarck have explained the development of small jaw size in the snakes? So according to how these snakes would have evolved, using Lamarck's theory, how would he explain that these snakes ended up with small jaws? So you must apply all the things that you know about Lamarck's theory. So let us take a look at the answers for number one. So what are the laws that Lamarck uses to explain his theory of evolution? Those are the law of use and disuse, 1 mark. And then the law of inheritance of acquired characteristics. Inheritance of acquired characteristics. Sometimes you mess up the words there. You say inheritance of characteristics acquired, but you can still get it right if it makes sense. But just inheritance of acquired characteristics for it to make sense. So it's IAC. So this is the second law that he uses. Now, according to these two laws, how would he say that the snakes ended up with the small jaws? So you can get 4 marks for that. Let us see. Now I'm trying to assist you now to use Lamarck's theory to understand how he would have explained this. Right. Lamarck would have said, since the snake's jaws were used less or not used, remember the snakes ended up not using, the jaw size were becoming smaller, they decreased in size. The snakes developed smaller jaws, so they became smaller. They did not use them more. So here it is the law of disuse. Remember I said you are going to apply it based on the question. So because they did not use, the snakes developed smaller jaws, and these characteristics of smaller jaw was then inherited by the offspring. So you see the characteristic inherited by the offspring, because this characteristics was acquired. Then the jaw of the snakes became smaller. Hence now we have all the snakes with smaller jaws, and they can now survive more. Why? Because they do not eat the toads. Remember, why are they surviving more? They are surviving more because remember we said the toads have a poison that kills the snakes. So if the snakes are not eating the toads, what does that mean? It means more snakes are going to survive because then they are not going to be killed. So having that small jaw helped the snakes to survive more. Hence, we had an increase in the survival of the snakes. So smaller jaws, according to Lamarck, would have evolved in this way. So I hope this example makes sense to you. Then you can apply this Lamarckism to another scenario. So I'll just give you a scenario. Please just take note or take a picture of the next scenario. Then try to apply Lamarck's theory on that scenario on your own. All right. Okay. Before we get to that, we will just discuss. We can just discuss this. I will give you that question. I think it's coming up next. Now, when answering questions based on Lamarck's theory, you must remember the following things. Remember, in an exam, you can be asked with a scenario to explain how Lamarck would have used his theory to explain how the particular organisms evolved or particular species evolved. Or you can be asked about the laws to state them as pure and as plain as they are using a generic answer. But here are the things that you need to look out for. An inherited characteristic is a characteristic that an offspring is born with. Now, having been inherited from one parent, a characteristic is controlled by a gene. This is something that we know. But with Lamarck's theory, we know this is not the case. So for you to inherit something, it must be controlled by the genes that you inherited from your parents. But with Lamarck, he does not talk about inherited character. He speaks about acquired characteristics. So these ones, you acquire them as you go on in life. You are not born with them. Acquired characteristic is a characteristic that an offspring is not born with. So this one is the one that Lamarck is talking about, but which develops and is acquired through the course of its lifetime. So through the course of its lifetime, you have acquired this particular characteristic. And then this characteristic is not controlled by a gene, because it is therefore going to be something that you learn, that you do on the physical. So you do it on the physical. Right. What are the guiding questions that you can look for when applying Lamarck's theory? These are the questions that you need to ask yourself first. Every time when you are given a question, check, what was the original characteristic? So with the example that we did previously, so we said the jaws were large. Remember, that was originally. And then what was the challenge? What happened? Why did they become smaller? They stopped eating or what? And then what did the organism do? Or what characteristics was then acquired? They became smaller. What was the result? The snakes lived more because they had smaller jaws. What happened to the acquired characteristic? These characteristics was passed on to the next generation. And then what was the result of this? More snakes with small jaws. So you see, all of these can apply to any question. Any question. So you must just check all of these when you are applying Lamarck's theory. So this is an example that I was talking about. This is an extract that is telling you about the Tibetans. So the Tibetans are the people or a tribe. This is a tribe of people. Tribe of people. So even if you check them on the internet, the Tibetans, you will see what type of people they were. And then it says that the mutations in the genes allow the Tibetans to survive. Is it possible to cope with low oxygen content at high altitudes? High altitudes is where those people that are living on the mountains or high mountains. So I'm just trying to make you understand what is happening on these diagrams, on this extract. Now, one way is for the body to produce more red blood cells in response to an increase in altitude. So this is how they can survive. More red blood cells can be produced. Another way of coping has developed in the Tibetans. Now, the Tibetans have developed their own way of surviving where? In high altitude. So high altitude, you know that there is low oxygen. You always say the higher you get, the colder it gets. So today we are saying the higher you go, the less oxygen there is available for you. Now, the Tibetans can have more red blood cells that will transport the oxygen in their body, or they have this way now. The Tibetans, as a result of gene mutation that they had inherited from their ancestors. The mutant gene, so meaning there was a mutation that took place. And now this mutation kept on being passed on to the next offspring of the Tibetans, the tribe of people. Now, the mutant gene helps them to use the low amount of oxygen present more efficiently, meaning this mutation that took place was beneficial to them because it helps them to use less oxygen. It has made their body to adapt to using less oxygen. Now, the mutant gene was found in more than 87% of the Tibetan population. Remember, we said this is a tribe of people. Now, in this Tibetan population, but only 9% of the Han population. So here is another population, the Han population, that lived at lower altitudes than the Tibetans. So those ones that lived at lower altitudes, only 9% of them had the mutation. But those that lived at high mountains or at high altitude, 87% of them had this beneficial mutation, which helped them to survive at low oxygen levels. Now, describe how Lamarck would have explained the survival of the Tibetans at high altitude. So according to Lamarck, what would he say that helped the Tibetans that lived at high altitude to survive? So I want you to take that as homework. I've explained to you what is happening in this extract. Then take this as homework and try to explain to us how would Lamarck have explained that the Tibetans have acquired or they have survived at high altitude. Right. So I just want us to move. That is our answer, but I want you to go and work on it yourself. Right. We said Lamarck's theory is rejected. So there's no need for you to worry about it. However, even if it was rejected, you still need to know what it says. So it doesn't mean when we say it was rejected, you don't need to study it. You need to study it for explanation purposes, for you to be able to explain to us how he would have explained it, even though we know at the back of our mind that it was rejected. Rejected. Thumbs down. You see, Lamarck's theory was rejected. But why? Why was it rejected? This is an examination question. You must know, why was Lamarck's theory rejected? Right, let's check. Down. Thumbs down. Lamarck's theory was rejected because of these reasons. Number one, there is no evidence that acquired characteristics are inherited by offspring. How do you know that those acquired characteristics are inherited by offspring? Is there evidence that shows us that the parents were like this and now the offspring are like this? They have inherited that? No. So because of this acquired characteristics being inherited by offspring, no evidence of this, it was rejected. Number two, it was rejected because organisms did not evolve because they were determined to do it or they wanted to. You can say wanted to. Can you really evolve because you want to? I think if we all wanted to evolve, or we all were determined to evolve, don't you think all of us as human beings would have wanted to grow wings? And then maybe we would continue flapping our arms up and down, eventually we will have wings. So if you evolve based on you being determined to, hey, that will not be real science. So that is another reason why his theory was rejected. It was rejected because organisms did not evolve because they wanted to or because they were determined to change, but changes took place randomly due to mutations. So some changes, yes, they occurred, but it was not because the organisms wanted to. It was due to some mutations in the genes that might be beneficial or that might bring a characteristic that is new and that can be beneficial to those organisms. So not because the organisms wanted to themselves. And then It was rejected because an organism cannot change its DNA. You can't just say, I want to change my DNA and have this, or this particular characteristic. So this is another reason. Then, according to Mendel, the grandfather of genetics, you remember Gregor Mendel? It is the genotype that determines the phenotype of an organism, not the other way around. Remember, your genes or the alleles that you carry in your genes are the ones that are going to determine the characteristic that you have. If you have black hair, it is because of the genes that you have that gives you that black hair. Not you have black hair and then you're going to give that black hair to your kids and then it's going to make their genes to have black hair. So it does not work the other way round. The genes or the genotype are the one that is going to determine the phenotype, what we see on the physical. So all of these, study them. These are the reasons why Lamarck's theory was rejected. Right. Then we come to the second scientist who has his own theory also of trying to explain how organisms evolved, which is Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin published a book in 1859. So this was still in the 1800s, but later than Lamarck. So Charles Darwin in 1859, he published a book called The Origin of Species. So this is the name of the book. Origin of Species by means of natural selection. Now this word here, very important. So we're going to check how now does Charles Darwin think evolution occurred. And as you are going down, these scientists trying to check how they explain the theory of evolution, are you aware that at the beginning we said evolution is a theory and it is not law? Meaning you can still do some research because not all scientists support it. So you can also still come up with your own theory of evolution and do all the necessary investigative work and all the experiments to support your theory of evolution. We will see that is what recently Eldridge and Gould did as they continue to study. So it's an open study. So if you are sitting there, you are a scientist, you can also start your own study and tell us how do you think organisms evolved, because clearly organisms are not the same eventually, all in the world, and we can see some organisms are related, but then you can tell us according to your own theory, how do you think these organisms evolved. So now we are studying the second person, Charles Darwin. He also did some studies. He studied in the Galapagos Island. He spent a lot of time there trying to explain what is happening, what is happening with this species or with organisms. So he then eventually came with his own theory of how he thinks organisms evolved. Then try to make this one make sense to you, then you can compare it to Lamarck's. So let's see, how does he think organisms evolved? His theory was based on the two main points. Like with Lamarck, he also has his two main points. Darwin says, the first point here, species were not created in their present form, but evolved from ancestral species. That is the whale evolution. So this is the whales here. So he says this species of the whale was not created this way. It was not created as a whale, but it evolved. It evolved from the ancestral species. So this one we can say is the ancestor. So that is what it says here. Species were not created the way they are or the way you see them today. However, they evolved from their ancestral species. And then he continues to say, number two, he proposed a mechanism for evolution by natural selection. So we're going to explain, what does he mean by natural selection? I know most of you like to explain natural selection as the survival of the fittest. It is true. The survival of the fittest. So meaning an organism that has the most favorable characteristics in that particular environment will be the one that is going to survive. So that is natural selection, according to him. And then as it survives, then it will pass its genes to the next offspring. So, but we will check exactly what he means by this. But I hope you understand. First, he says organisms are not, and they were not created as they are, but they evolved from their ancestral species. Number two, he explains that what is this? Evolution took place by natural selection. So those are the two things that Darwin is saying, and they are not the same as what Lamarck was saying. So according to Darwin, this is just a picture diagram to explain to you how he thinks evolution occurred as a process. So when he starts, he says there is genetic variation within a population. So here you see this is a population of butterflies. So you see there are yellow butterflies and there are brown butterflies. So initially, unlike with Lamarck, he does not say all butterflies were yellow or all butterflies were brown. But he starts by saying there was a genetic variation within a population. Now here, what was the genetic variation? Yellow and brown. Then, as they were living in that particular environment, what happened? There was an overproduction of offspring, which led to competition for survival. If the yellow produced more, reproduced, let's use the correct terminology, reproduced. So you see, agere butterflies comes from larva to this worm. So you remember that the life cycle of a butterfly, but here they are going to give us the yellow butterfly. So the yellow butterflies have reproduced 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And the brown butterflies have reproduced also 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But they are still living in the same environment, meaning they are going to compete for food because now there is more of them. There is more butterflies. So he says, when these organisms are living in a same area, there's going to be a competition because there is now an overproduction and the space is no longer equal or is no longer sufficient or enough for all of them. Then there's going to be competition. Now, this competition is going to bring us what? Let us see. Adaptation. Now, those individuals with beneficial adaptations are more likely to survive. So if you take a look at this diagram here, the brown butterflies, because they were standing on, or they were on the brown ground here, the predators, when they come, they are not going to see them as these yellow ones. The yellow ones are more bright and they can be seen. So, meaning they are more eaten. As they are more eaten, they don't survive the environment. But the ones that have a beneficial characteristic or a favorable characteristic for that particular environment are going to survive, which is the brown ones in this case. And then natural selection is going to take place. Now, over many generations, now there is a change in the allele frequency, meaning the organisms are going to do what? To have more brown. Why? Because the brown survived in this competition or in this phenomenon here. So when he explains this fully, he will say that organisms with a beneficial adaptation or characteristics are going to survive. And when they survive, look at what is happening on this last column or the last diagram. Most of them are the brown ones because the brown ones were not eaten by the predators. And what is going to happen to the brown ones? As they reproduce, you can already think more brown are going to survive, or we are going to have more the next generation with more brown butterflies. So this is just a gist or an idea, but we have to look at it exactly word for word or step by step as it is explained in the exam guideline to say, how would Darwin explain the theory of evolution using natural selection? So you need to be careful of that. Here, this one is the one that you need to know off by heart. Even if we wake you in the middle of the night, you should be able to explain to us, how does Darwin explain natural selection? So Darwin says, at first, when you start, there is a great deal of variation amongst the offspring. So by just saying that, you are going to get a mark. Just remember that when it starts, says there's variation, meaning not everything is the same. There is variation amongst the species or in the offspring. Some, then he goes on to explain that variation. Some have favorable characteristics and some do not. You get a mark for saying that. Some have a favorable characteristics, some do not. Then, when there is a change in the environmental conditions, or if there is competition, you get a mark for saying that. So you're saying, yes, they were not the same. Some have favorable, some do not have favorable. Then, when there's competition or there's an environmental change, what is going to happen? The organisms with characteristics which make them more suited or more favorable, or the organisms with a favorable characteristic, are going to survive. You get a mark for saying those that are more suited, and then you get a mark for saying they are going to survive. And then, while the organisms with unfavorable characteristics, which make them less suited, are going to die. So you see, the organisms that survive reproduce. This now is very important. Here. So we can all start here to say, okay, what was the story? What was happening? They were different. Some had favorable, some did not. And then those, when there was change in the environment or there was competition, those that did not have favorable characteristics, they died. Those that have favorable characteristics survived. So you see, you've already collected marks. Then what is going to happen with those that survive? They are going to reproduce. And when they reproduce, what are they passing? They pass on the allele. Now, do you see here? We are talking about the allele. They pass the allele for the favorable characteristics to their offspring. So you must talk about an allele now, because this is genetic. The next generation will therefore have a higher proportion of individuals with favorable characteristics. So there are so many marks that you can get. Mostly you will be asked for 6 maximum marks. So please make sure that you collect all these marks. So when you take a look at this diagram over here of these finches, this is explaining natural selection in a nutshell. Originally, the offspring were what? There was variation in the offspring. And when there was variation in the offspring, there was the environment changed and it brought what? Competition. So they were competing. So when they were competing, what was competition or change in the environment? Okay, here we can say the change in the environment was that the more predators wanted green beetles. So there were yellow beetles and green beetles, or the orange beetles and the green beetles. So the environment in this case, the environmental condition was that the predators wanted the green beetles. Now the green beetles became eaten. And as they were eaten, meaning they were more visible to the predators than the orange ones. And when they were more visible or more favored, it means they have an unfavorable characteristic for that environment. And the orange ones have a favorable characteristic for this environment. So the orange ones were not eaten, the green ones were eaten. So the green ones have a favorable characteristic and an unfavorable characteristics. They were eaten and they died. But the orange one had an unfavorable characteristic. They survived. And after they survived, look what is happening. They reproduced. more. So you see, as they reproduce, you end up with the generation that has a higher proportion of individuals with a favorable characteristic. So you just need to check what was the favorable characteristic here, what was the unfavorable, and how were they initially. There was variation, there was competition. The one with the favorable characteristics survived, reproduced, and more individuals of a favorable characteristic were therefore found in the next generation. So this is just a brief explanation of all of this. Please make sure that you remember all these points because you must know them off by heart and know how they flow. Excuse me. Right. So this is an example where you need to apply the Darwin's theory of evolution. Let us check what is happening in this extract. I would also like for you to do this extract at home. A population of lizards on an island, island A, were well suited to feed mainly on insects. So meaning the lizards on island A ate insects. Scientists moved 5 adult pairs of lizard species to a neighboring island, island B. So scientists took 5 from island A that was able to eat insects. They put them in island B. I need you to follow. Then here they reproduced and a new population formed. Island B has a larger supply of plants. Now, remember island A, we had insects. Island B now, we have plants. And these organisms that were brought to island B, they used to eat insects. With tough, fibrous leaves and fewer insects. So the insects here were few in island B. Exposure to this new environment may have caused the lizards to undergo evolution. So you can think the environment changed. Right. 36 years later, scientists returned to island B to conduct further investigations on the lizard population there. They observed that the jaw size of the lizard had increased, meaning the jaw size of the lizard had increased. Now you think, why is it increasing? What is it trying to accommodate? What are the lizards having to eat now in island B? Scientists also analyzed the stomach content of lizards and found that it was mainly plant-based. So what does this tell you? Now the lizards that were taken from initially from island A that were eating insects, the offspring that came after and after and after is now eating plants because most of the organisms that were found to be eaten in island B were plants. So you are trying to make sense of what is happening here. They also confirmed that the two populations still belong to the same species. So now you understand. You still have those lizards, but now these lizards that are found in island B are eating plants and their jaws have become small. So use Darwin's theory of natural selection to explain the evolution of lizards with larger jaws. So we can just take a look at this one quickly because I want you to check what happened or how Darwin would have explained. So there was variation in the size of the lizard's jaws. Remember, when you are given an example like this, in your answers, we must see the examples. We must see the organisms that were spoken about here. So you are not going to say there was variation. Where? You need to specify. There was variation in the lizard's jaws, meaning some lizards have small jaws and others have large jaws. Now you are explaining what? Number 2 is explaining this variation, because when you say there's variation, it can mean anything. But we need to be specific and come to the example that we were given. Here they are talking about the size of the jaws. So when you say there was variation in the lizard jaws, you must tell us what that variation was. Number 2, and then you get a mark. You say there were lizards with small jaws and others have large jaws. You are explaining that variation. Now, after this, due to a larger supply of fibrous plants, meaning change in the environment. This is the change in environment. Remember, the initial environment was to eat the insects, but now the environment changed to have, remember this was island B, have a large supply of fibrous plants, or it had fewer insects. Those with smaller jaws will be able to feed. Why are they able to feed? Because they are feeding on plants. Those with smaller jaws will be unable, they will be unable to feed. Remember, we said these fibrous plants. Fibrous is something that is hard and tough. So you need a larger jaw. So these ones with smaller jaws, meaning it is an unfavorable characteristic. They are going to do what? They are not going to be able to feed, and therefore they are going to die. Whereas the lizards with larger jaws will have more food because their jaws are large and they can eat fibrous plants, and they are going to survive. So meaning larger jaws is favorable. Then after surviving, what are they going to do? They are going to reproduce. Just waiting to survive, reproduce, you get a mark. Then the allele, very important, for larger jaws will be passed on to the offspring. Then the next generation will have a higher proportion of lizards with larger jaws. So this is how Darwin would have explained this situation here. So always have the generic in mind, but apply the example in your generic when you are asked to do so. Right. So this is just another example that I would like for you to explain. How do you think Darwin would explain here? Look at year 4. Year 4. Look at the frogs. Year 4, you have all the black frogs there. Year 1, there were black and white frogs there. So lighter color and darker color. But after year 4, there is only black frogs. So you can use Darwin's theory trying to explain how do you think the frog population changed over the 4 years. So you will read this extract and explain. Remember, you use the generic to apply the example. So that is just an example. Then we come to the third explanation of evolution, or a third theory of evolution, that is punctuated equilibrium. Remember, we checked 1, that is Lamarckism. How would Lamarck explain that organisms evolved? Number 2, we had Darwin. How would Darwin explain that organisms evolved? Then we have Eldridge and Gould. These two scientists here, Eldridge and Gould, they are also trying to explain to us how do they think organisms evolved. This is a recent study. If you check 1972, some of your parents were already alive here. So this is the most accepted theory, but in conjunction with others, especially the one with this one, punctuated equilibrium, is in conjunction with Darwin's theory. However, the timing is what makes this one to be different. So let us check. What do Eldridge and Gould say organisms evolved, or how do they say these organisms evolved? So they say punctuated equilibrium explains the speed at which evolution takes place. So they are not scratching that evolution theory by Darwin, but they are adding more to say, but the timing or the speed at which it is happening needs to be looked at. That's when they come with the explanation of evolution by punctuated equilibrium. So, how do they explain this punctuated equilibrium? They say evolution involves long periods of time where species undergo little change or do not change. So I want to put this one in absolute brackets there. There is little change. So they say evolution involves long periods of time where species undergo little change or do not change. So this stage will be the one that is known as equilibrium. So there's little change or no change at all. That is still at the equilibrium, meaning organisms that we are going to find on the equilibrium stage are going to be the same or more similar. Why the same? The same because you said they do not change. More similar because there is little change. Then this alternates with, which is punctuated, short periods of time where rapid changes occur through natural selection. So you see now, they are not scratching natural selection, but they are now saying, let us take a look at the time in which this is happening. So it is followed by a time where there is rapid change occurring through natural selection, during which new species may form in a short period. So when you explain this, you can say there was no change, organisms were the same, and then shoot, organisms change suddenly. So there is a new character or characteristic. So they say evolution takes place in this way. Long periods of no change, which is equilibrium, followed by rapid change. A period of rapid change through natural selection. If you take a look at this diagram here, it shows the species of the horse over 5 million of years. So when you take here the first part, you see that this horse, the ancestor, was small, and then it grew gradually, it changed, and then it changed, and then up to this one here. So this is under normal circumstances what you would expect. However, Eldridge and Gold here, they are talking about punctuated equilibrium, where you see the horse remained the same or similar over a long period here. You see this line, still the same. And then shoot, you have a different species or a bigger horse suddenly without seeing the change. Because you did not see the change here. It was just an equilibrium or long periods of no change followed by a rapid change. So according to them, this is how evolution takes place. But even this rapid change that they are saying, they say it forms by, or it is formed by, natural selection. So that is what they explain. So we can take a look at this diagram also of the mice here. So according to natural selection as we know it, it happens gradually. So that is gradualism. So gradualism would mean organisms are going to undergo slow, gradual changes in the species occurring as a result of a series of small changes. So if you see here from the initial mouse, number 1, you see to number 2, there is small change, right? You can see that there's not much of a change that is happening here. It is becoming lighter, but not too much. And then this also evolved to becoming more lighter. And then another is becoming darker. So this is just because of evolution. And then these ones that have become lighter, over time also they become more light until they are white. And these ones that evolved to be brown or darker end up becoming brown. So all of this is happening gradually. gradually, according to this diagram here. But Eldridge and Gould, they have a different theory. This here is Eldridge and Gould. So Eldridge and Gould, they say there is rapid change occurs and it is followed by long periods of no change. So you see the organisms when you started here, the same. And then gradually it was here. So gradually this is equilibrium, no change. Ne? But before it got to that, you were expecting to see it growing this way or growing it this way. Then you see rapid change here. Rapid evolution. It went from being darker to being light without you seeing the intermediate. Where is the intermediate? Why didn't you see it becoming just a little bit lighter before it became too light? We can just say too light. So there's nothing here in between, or there's nothing here in the middle. So it shows that there was just rapid change. And then over time, it was equilibrium. And then you see here also, you would expect it to grow this way. But with punctuated equilibrium, it takes a sharp curve to the left, meaning there's a new characteristic that is coming out rapidly. So it becomes too dark without you seeing the intermediate. No intermediate. So this is punctuated equilibrium. It is long periods of no change followed by rapid change occurring. So every time when you want to see the difference between gradualism and punctuated equilibrium will have sharp curves. Will have sharp curves, sudden change that you did not expect. But with gradualism, you see change is gradual. You see it coming. But with this one, you don't see it coming. I think now you understand how Eldridge and Gould would explain how organisms evolved. And then you need to also know what is artificial selection. Some of the characteristics as men, we want to have them ourselves. So we want to choose which characteristics we want in certain organisms. So artificial selection is the intentional reproduction of individuals in a population that have desirable traits. So this one is going to help us as human beings. So we want to have that desirable trait. Examples can be domesticated animals. Look at the chickens that we had in 1957. It was fine with the weight of 900 grams. But recently, in 2005, all of us want a chicken with a big mass of 4,200 grams. So what do? We are going to intentionally reproduce, taking the chickens with big mass and reproducing it with another chicken with big mass, so we can get a chicken with big mass. Then this is going to have a desirable trait that we want as human beings. Another example is of different cows through selection. If you want a cow for milk or high milk production, you can intentionally reproduce milk with high milk yield, or with crops of species. You can check here. You want to have cabbage. Look at the species of cabbage here. Cabbage as you know it, but this is a big family of cabbages. But it came from where? It came from this ancestral species. So what did the scientists do? They artificially took the characteristics they want, or an organism with the characteristic they want. They bred it with another to produce another with another characteristics that they want. So that is all that artificial selection is all about. So you are intentionally reproducing individuals in a population that have desirable traits. So this one is not the same as with GMOs and what did you do when you were doing genetics. So here you are manipulating the evolution yourself. Right? So this is a question. It is a general question that is based on the 3 theories that you have learned. So this is an example showing you. The diagram below represents 3 ideas proposed to explain evolution. So you see the giraffe here becomes large, then here. You can already think which theory is here. Here you see they are not the same, and then still not the same, and then eventually you have long ones. Then here you have these short ones, and then short, and then suddenly you have long ones. So what does million of years stands for? No, I gave you the answer there. What does MYA stand for? If you were listening, you had the answer. It stands for millions of years ago. Million years ago. So here, this MYA here, it shows you million of years ago. Remember, we said evolution does not take place overnight. It takes place over a million of years. Now, give the letter of the diagram A, B, or C. That would be present. So, what that would represent a punctuated equilibrium. So, according to your knowledge of punctuated equilibrium, which diagram here shows punctuated equilibrium? I want you to think of that just for a few seconds. B, Lamarck's explanation of evolution. Remember Lamarck, law of use and disuse. Then, Darwin's explanation of evolution. Which of these, A, B, or C, represents punctuated equilibrium? That would be C. So let us check it. C. See what is happening. This is punctuated equilibrium. Why? You see there is no change from here to here. They are the same. And then suddenly you see what? This long giraffes with long necks. So this shows what? Punctuated. So you see? So that is why C is punctuated equilibrium. Lamarck's explanation of evolution. Lamarck would be A. A would say initially they were short. They kept on stretching their necks. And then their necks became longer. And then we ended up with giraffes in the present with long necks. So you see, just as simple as that. And then Darwin, here is the key. Initially, there was a variation. There was giraffes with long neck, or medium neck, short necks, and long necks. So this shows what? Variation. Then it tells you this is Darwin. Then those with undesirable characteristics, meaning would be the one with the short neck, because then they will not be able to reach the trees, would die. And then eventually today we end up with long neck. So this is how Charles Darwin would explain. So this is Darwin and this is Lamarck. So that is how you got your answers. And then the next part that you need to study, which I think we will delve much more into next week, because it needs more time. It needs you to understand fully so you don't confuse it with the theories that you've learned today. Today, you need to take home the 3 theories that you've learned: the theory of evolution by Lamarck, the theory of evolution by Charles Darwin, the theory of evolution by Eldridge and Gould, which is punctuated equilibrium. And then you need to know what is artificial selection. However, for the next lesson, we need to know how are organisms formed, or new species formed. I would like to take more time explaining the formation of species without hurrying and giving you proper examples, because this is a question that weighs a lot of marks in the exam. However, for that, you need to know terminology. So let us take a look at this diagram. When you see here, you see there is an organism. Organism is one organism. I think you all know what an organism is. So an organism has different systems, different tissues formed by this. So this is an organism. Then you come to a population. Many organisms form a population, right? And they have to be in the same habitat. or place. Habitat is the place where they live. And then different populations form a community. A community comprises of different organisms, different populations, and yes, different species. So this is a community now. Community is larger. And they are different, you see, different populations of zebras, of the springboks, you see, of the lions there. So this forms a community. And then an ecosystem is where all the populations on and the community is interacting with the non-biotic. Then we call it an ecosystem. Now you are interacting the living and the non-living organisms, populations, communities in an ecosystem interacting with non-living organisms. And then you have a bigger sphere where all living things are found, and then it is the biosphere where all of this is found. Right, but let us take a look at the terminology. The terminology, the first one, this one a life sciences learner must know even in their sleep. What is a species? Species are organisms that have the same characteristics, that are capable of random interbreeding, or that can interbreed and produce a fertile offspring. Remember, I said all three must be there for it to be a species. Same characteristics, able to interbreed and produce a fertile offspring. Then we can say those things are of the same species. Then what is a population? A population are individuals of the same species. Now, this. Of the same species, living in the same area, that can randomly interbreed. Here, what are you adding? You are saying the same species, same area or habitat. So area can be a habitat, but they can also be able to randomly interbreed. They are a population. So it is a group of the same species living in the same habitat and that are able to interbreed. We call that a population. So a population of mice, a population of what? A population of what? I think you understand. Then what is speciation, which I say we will discuss this further next week. Speciation is the evolution or evolutionary process by which populations evolve to become distinct species. So this one is a step that you need to follow to say, how do organisms then become different species? Originally an organism was this, but now you check. Remember when we were doing biogeography, we spoke about organisms that arose from a common ancestor. They look similar, but they are found in different parts of the world. It is because they have undergone the process of speciation. They have evolved to become distinct species, even though they arose from a common ancestor. So that is a whole technical process that you need to study to say, how can that happen? So you will tell us, including that biogeography, evidence for evolution. And then geographical isolation and reproductive isolation. Now, this one are the mechanisms to isolate the gene pool of species, resulting with the formation of new species. Now, sometimes when the organisms were the same, and then they were separated by a geographical barrier. Let's say this is a geographical barrier. And then they all evolve. I don't want to explain speciation because then it will take me to speciation. Let us say they all evolve. And as they evolve, you may find that they are not able to interbreed. Not able to interbreed. Why? Because they become different species. when they become different species, those mechanisms that stop them from interbreeding, we call them mechanisms of reproductive isolation, or mechanisms, yes, of reproductive isolation, because organisms, when they evolve, they change everything. Then you might find that these ones, they will reproduce in summer, these ones, they want to reproduce in winter. So that will be a mechanism for reproductive isolation. Because they are no longer the same species, they cannot reproduce. Then we will check what are these mechanisms. There are many that we can look out for, so we will look out for that next week. So this is just the terminology to warm you up for what we are going to discuss in speciation. So I would like to end our lesson here for today, so that we don't get into speciation, and then you will be ready. Go and look out for speciation, and when you are looking at speciation, go and look at the geographic isolation mechanism, or look at the geographical barriers, and check how species can form new species. Go and follow all the steps. So until we meet again next week, thank you so much for watching this lesson. See you again next time. Bye-bye.